Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little electric, a little forbidden, and deeply human. The complete history of MDMA, from miracle therapy to global rave plague. Forget the neon glow and festival myths. Its origin story is rooted in chemistry labs, therapeutic offices, and moral panics, not just dance floors. The truth is, if you had dropped into any chapter of this tale, clinic breakthroughs, clandestine parties, or courtroom showdowns, you'd be out of your depth. The story asks you to hold gratitude and alarm in the same breath. Before you get too comfortable, give the video a like and subscribe if you're enjoying it. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. It's incredible to see viewers joining in from every corner of the world. Silence your notifications, take a deeper breath, and let's begin. In 1912, in a cool gas-lit laboratory on the outskirts of Darmstadt, an industrial chemist named Anton Köllisch put a faintly aromatic dark brown drop into a glass vial and wrote a notation that would sleep for decades in the margins of pharmaceutical history. He worked at the laboratories of E. Merck, a firm already famous across Europe for dyes, alkaloids, and the steady grind of chemical invention. The office walls smelled of paper and solvent. Ledger books lay open under soft lamplight. Men like Köllisch were paid to turn chemical possibility into patentable product, to bend the stubborn resistance of atoms into substances that could be sold to doctors, armies, and the occasional eccentric inventor. In that particular year, the molecule that would one day be called MDMA was nothing but another intermediate, a structural footnote in a patent application, a turn in a synthetic route towards substances Merck hoped might have commercial or medical value. There is an odd, almost comic dignity to that original context. A molecule birthed in the well-ordered routines of an industrial laboratory, recorded in the dry language of reagents and yields, and then left alone. At the time, amphetamine chemistry was a wider field with many glittering promises. Chemists were more interested in the primary leads that would become stimulants, decongestants, or cardiovascular tools. The methylene dioxy motif, a little ring of oxygen bridging two aromatic carbons, was a structural curiosity that turned up here and there as chemists explored ways to stabilize or modulate activity. Köllisch and his colleagues filed the paperwork. The patent was granted. The compound existed on paper and in dusty catalogue entries. No one in Darmstadt at that moment imagined it would become a cultural talisman one day, nor a subject of ecstatic therapy sessions, nor a pill pressed for neon-lit dance floors. The years that followed were not kind to idle chemical curiosities. Europe moved from imperial peace into the violent churn of the First World War, and Merck, like every firm, reallocated its technical energy toward immediate practicalities. War material, antiseptics, the crude arithmetic of survival. The molecule slept through those shifts, a line in the catalogue with no human voice to champion it. Over the next 40 years, the scientific conversation about psychoactive drugs took other directions. Natural alkaloids, morphine derivatives, and later the synthetics that would become stimulants and tranquilizers occupied the conversations of lab chiefs and medical journals. The chemical that Köllisch had made remained for decades an anonymous phantom in a patent file, searchable by a chemist who knew what to look for but otherwise invisible to most. It is tempting in a story like this to cast that dormancy as drama, as if a grand conspiracy or a wave of prudence put the molecule into a drawer, but the truth is quieter and colder. Priorities change, funding dries up, and molecules that do not immediately promise profit or cure are simply archived. The small entries in reagent catalogues are not frivolous. They are the long tail of industrial chemistry, the reserve bench of possibilities that might one day find players with different ambitions. And so the chemical lingered. Chemists travelling across Europe and later across the Atlantic would occasionally glance at these entries. They saw raw potential and nothing else. For 40, 50 years, the little structure waited, anonymous and patient. When it resurfaced in the latter half of the 20th century, the social meanings attached to it had shifted dramatically. What had been an intermediate in a Merck synthetic sequence became, in the minds of a new generation, a site of psychological possibility. That transformation, from an inert line in a patent to a word that would appear in therapists' notes, in police reports, and in the titles of nightclub hits, depended on the peculiar chemistry of the molecule itself, and on a culture ready to redistribute the molecule's uses. The long-dormant compound did not so much awaken as be reappraised, its potential reimagined by people working in a very different idiom, small labs, private psychotherapists, and a community of chemists who kept notebooks in the margins of their lives as well as in their benches. To understand why that reassessment occurred, it helps to sit very close to the thing itself, the molecule's shape, its affinities, the way it moves through the body and the mind. Chemically, it belongs to families with familiar names, phenethylamines and amphetamines. Those families are a kind of branching tree in organic chemistry. One change at a single place on the ring, one extra methyl group on the nitrogen, and the landscape of effects can tilt entirely. MDMA is a modestly decorated member of those families. The methylene dioxy bridge across the aromatic ring, the methyl group tucked against the nitrogen. On paper, those are small differences. In living beings, they modulate how the molecule passes through membranes, how it is recognized or transported by proteins, and how profoundly it alters the delicate balance of neurotransmitters in the brain. The pharmacology is at once blunt and exquisitely refined. The most important act MDMA performs is to make serotonin spill, to encourage the brain's serotonergic system to flood synapses in a way that ordinary stimulants do not. It gains entry into serotonergic neurons largely by piggybacking on the serotonin transporter, the protein that usually clears serotonin from the synaptic cleft and returns it to the presynaptic terminal. Once inside, MDMA prompts a reversal of the transporter and disturbs storage mechanisms, so that serotonin is effluxed into the extracellular space rather than conserved. The result is a surge of serotonin signaling, and the subjective correlate of that surge is among the most distinctive things about the drug. An expansive feeling, an ease of relating to others, a dampening of defensive fear. What clinicians and psychonauts later called emotional access. Serotonin is the headline, but the molecule does not act alone. It nudges dopamine and norepinephrine systems as well, though more modestly, and those secondary effects supply the stimulant posture of the experience. Increased heart rate, mild physical energy, alertness. Another layer is hormonal. MDMA promotes the release of oxytocin in many users, the same peptide hormone that midwives and neuroscientists often cite when talking about bonding between mother and infant, or the warmth between lovers. Oxytocin's role in MDMA's subjective profile is debated and complex, but it plausibly contributes to the peculiar combination of heightened sociability, trust, and lowered social defensiveness that users report. Brain imaging done in later decades would show a concordant pattern: attenuated amygdala responses to social threat, altered connectivity in networks related to social cognition, and a transient reshaping of the emotional salience of stimuli, such as faces and voices. In plain terms, the world feels warmer and other people less threatening. Because the effects scale with exposure, the matter of dose and route is not a trivial footnote. It is a central plot point in every experience. Taken orally, the molecule travels through the stomach, metabolizes partially in the liver, and arrives in the brain with a gentle, slow ascent, a soft rise of feeling that unfolds over tens of minutes and plateaus for hours. Snorted, the onset is sharper, the ascent steeper, the peak more sudden. Intravenous administration, rare outside lab reports or extreme circumstances, compresses the timeline even further, producing intensity with little forewarning. Each route reshapes the architecture of experience. A slow and luminous evening at home differs from a rapid combustible rush in a crowded room, and within those courses, the dose matters. A small exposure might simply blunt social anxiety and make conversation feel easier. A larger exposure amplifies sensory colour, increases tactile pleasure, and may border on overwhelming. The line between therapeutic opening and troubling overstimulation is not absolute. It is a negotiated frontier between body set and setting. Scientists, clinicians, and careful chroniclers found the subjective constellation peculiar enough to deserve a label. Somewhere between the categories of psychedelic and stimulant, a new term was coined by those trying to capture the unique quality of emotional access: intactogen, literally touching within. Others preferred empathogen, emphasizing the empathy-like effects. These were not simply semantic quibbles. The label signaled a recognition that MDMA did something different from LSD or amphetamine. It did not primarily produce the grand perceptual fracturing of a classic psychedelic, nor the overt arousal and behavioral activation of straight stimulants. Instead, it smoothed the social fabric of the mind, reducing defensiveness and enabling feelings that users described in language that sounded almost theological: openness, intuition, a felt clarity about one's emotional states. That clarity has practical implications. In controlled clinical settings, therapists who later experimented with the compound reported patients accessing traumatic memories without the paralyzing fear that often accompanies such retrieval. The idea was not that the drug dissolved problems, but that it reduced the defensive wall long enough for a patient to re-examine painful material with a different stance: curious, less reactive, more articulate. The pharmacology suggested a mechanism for this. Serotonergic flooding coupled with amygdala dampening and increased oxytocin could plausibly lower the terror that makes some memories unbearable without necessarily erasing cognitive control. The ethical and clinical complexities of such interventions are enormous, but the basic pattern repeated across case notes. People spoke more freely, therapists reported calmer, deeper sessions, and yet, for all its therapeutic promise, the molecule's pharmacokinetics and neurobiology carry real risks. The serotonergic surge is not an infinite well. After the peak, users often report a come-down marked by fatigue, mood dampening, and sleep disruption. At the physiological extreme, MDMA can disturb thermoregulation. In hot, crowded environments with vigorous exertion and inadequate fluid management, there is a real danger of hypothermia, the body's cooling systems overwhelmed. Conversely, MDMA's effects on vasopressin and feelings of thirst have in some tragic cases led to water intoxication, with dangerous hyponatremia. Interactions with other serotonergic drugs can precipitate serotonin syndrome, a potentially life-threatening state of neuromuscular hyperactivity and autonomic instability. Preclinical studies in animals also raised concerns about long-term effects on serotonergic terminals after high or repeated exposures, sparking debates that would last for decades. How much of the animal data translates to human risk? And what patterns of use are safe versus dangerous? The answers were and remain complex, dependent on patterns of use, purity of substances, context, and biological variability. Purity is a separate social risk. On the legal market today, a tablet labelled ecstasy might be MDMA, it might be an amphetamine, it might be PMA or PMMA, substances that carry much greater dangers at comparable doses. The social life of MDMA, once confined to small lab notebooks and therapy rooms, eventually mixed with the murk of clandestine manufacture and mass distribution. Adulterants, mislabelling, and the industrial pressures to produce high volumes of pills transformed a molecule with a relatively narrow pharmacological identity into a brand name capable of encompassing a chaotic array of compounds. Those market realities would later feed tragedies and policy debates. But in the quieter decades of rediscovery, before the name became a nightclub cry, chemists and psychotherapists were most interested in the molecule's mind-mending potential. It is here that Alexander Sasha Shulgin enters the story, a man whose life embodied the awkward marriage between meticulous bench chemistry and an almost religious curiosity about subjective experience. Shulgin, an American chemist born in 1925 and working for decades in California, had a temperament ideally suited to the revival. He was at once an old-school synthesist and an acute explorer of consciousness, someone who kept notebooks as if they were maps of other worlds. In the 1960s and 1970s, As the larger culture cycled through psychedelic experimentation, Shulgin devoted himself to synthesizing variants on phenethylamines and amphetamines, cataloguing not only yields and melting points, but subjective effects with a scrupulousness bordering on tenderness. Shulgin's rediscovery of MDMA was less an isolated eureka, and more the sort of slow, careful unearthing that defines much of chemistry. He found an old reference, reconstructed the synthesis in his modest lab, and then, characteristically, subjected the result to the least glamorous but most illuminating of tests, human bioassay, beginning with himself. The mythic line that often appears in telling such stories, the lone chemist taking a single dose and collapsing the world into revelation, contains a kernel of truth, yet it should be understood in context. Shulgin's approach was systematic and ethical in its own subcultural way. Small measured exposures, detailed notes, repeated observations over time, and a readiness to share his findings with a tight-knit community of therapists and chemists who treated such matters with seriousness rather than sensationalism. What made Shulgin's work catalytic was not merely synthesis, but communication. He did not hoard molecules as trophies. He wrote, he spoke, and he passed samples in the gentlest possible manner to skilled therapists who were curious about their potential as adjuncts to psychotherapy. One of the earliest therapists to pick up the thread was a California practitioner named Leo Zeff, who, upon experiencing the compound in the late 1970s, found in it a method to facilitate therapeutic work and took to bringing the drug into his practice as a tool. Zeff, with the lyrical career of a countercultural healer, called the compound Adam, a name meant to evoke the idea of a return to an unguarded state. The term caught on in certain circles, signalling a rebranding of the molecule away from the industrial anonymity and toward an interpersonal, almost liturgical use. The diffusion was mediated by networks that were hardly clandestine in the malevolent sense. They were simply informal, composed of people who trusted one another with their professional reputations and their clients' welfare. Therapists in California, in parts of Colorado, and even in small pockets in Europe began to experiment cautiously, combining empathogenic sessions with conventional psychotherapy. Notes were exchanged. The molecule was described not as an elixir, but as an opening, a tool that required careful preparation and integration. The culture around it was pragmatic. Set and setting were foregrounded, intake and aftercare discussed, and the potential for harm acknowledged. This was a kind of underground that resembled a seminar more than a conspiracy. Quiet, ethically fraught, but earnest. Shulgin's contributions were both chemical and cultural. He documented his experiments in the manner of a patient naturalist. Precise descriptions of subjective states, lists of perceptual changes, the uncomfortable hours of insomnia, the oddity of appetite loss, the aftertaste of melancholy some users reported on the day after a session. Those notes would become, by the late 20th century, a touchstone for a generation of psychonauts and later for clinicians who sought to legitimize the therapeutic potential of MDMA in the face of legal prohibitions. The publication of Shulgin's broader compendium of phenethylamines and their effects, a mixture of synthesis notes, psychopharmacological musings, and anecdotal reports, codified a style of investigation that mixed the rigor of chemistry with the humility of participant observation. It was, in a sense, a laboratory note written for the bedside. There is delicious irony here. A molecule designed, at least in the vision of early 20th century industrial chemists, to be a cog in the machinery of pharmaceutical product development, was coaxed into a different life by hobbyist chemists and therapists who prize subjective nuance over market share. The social scale was tiny at first, a handful of clinicians, a few chemists, some earnest clients. The logistics of this revival were humble. Small amber bottles exchanged at kitchen tables, careful instructions about how to arrange a session, phone calls between practitioners about reactions and integration. The scale was human. That intimacy shaped the culture around MDMA's early therapeutic use. Because the people involved were few, they could insist upon responsibility. That would not remain the case forever. The molecule's later migrations into club culture and clandestine mass production would rewrite the rules entirely. For now, in the soft decades between Merck's patent pages and the manufacturing plants that would later press pills, MDMA's life was one of intimate experimentation and careful record-keeping. In the rooms where it was used therapeutically, people often described a peculiar contrast, vivid sensory detail and a simultaneous feeling of interior clarity, like being in a room with the lights turned up enough to see the dust motes and the fine lines in a friend's face. There were moments of sorrow that felt purifying rather than crushing, moments of laughter that felt more like recognition than escape. Therapists took notes, clients were asked to integrate. There was no sense of inevitability about what the molecule would become. It was still in many ways a fragile secret, one that required stewardship to respect the thin margin between insight and harm. The psychonaut movement that Shulgin helped to nourish was not merely a subculture of thrill-seekers. It was an epistemic community, a distributed laboratory of sorts, where knowledge circulated in both formal and informal channels, journal articles and private letters, parties and therapy sessions, bench notebooks, and oral tradition. That porousness was both its strength and a vulnerability. It allowed rapid sharing of observations, what worked, what fizzled, what frightened, but it also meant that the molecule's practices could leak into contexts that were not prepared to manage the physiological and social risks. In the short term, the rediscovery produced promising clinical anecdotes, and a small but fervent following of users and therapists who swore by its capacity to dissolve certain defensive patterns. In the longer term, those same mechanisms of diffusion would make the molecule public property, for better and worse. Shulgin's role was not heroic in the blockbuster sense. It was quieter, more substantial, a chemist who bridged technical knowledge and a felt interest in human experience, who documented his findings without the grandstanding of a commercial sponsor, and who threw open, in his careful way, a door that others could walk through. He trained a generation of amateur chemists and inspired therapists who would, with varying degrees of caution, take up MDMA as a therapeutic adjunct. He wrote, and the writing mattered, detailed accounts that invited others to replicate observations without telling anyone exactly how to make the molecule. That distinction between sharing knowledge about effects and sharing instructions for manufacture would become crucial as regulators and law enforcement agencies took notice. Beneath the chronicle of synthesis and subjective notes there ran a human current of irony and tenderness. The molecule's life began in a German industrial lab, embedded in the capitalist machinery of medicinal chemistry. It was then patiently catalogued and quietly revived by an American chemist who loved to tinker, who loved to record, and who loved to talk about human feelings as if they were species to be catalogued. The people who first gave MDMA its therapeutic reputation were, by inclination and habit, caretakers, therapists who regarded altered states as clinical tools rather than markets. That ethos, fragile and local, shaped the early decades of MDMA's re-emergence. It would later collide with other forces of scale and commerce that had nothing to do with careful clinical practice, but that's a story for another chapter, when the molecule's social meaning was reconfigured again, and with it the ethical and regulatory questions it posed. For now, the molecule sat in the hands of a small and curious tribe, chemists with an old-fashioned respect for bench notes, clinicians who experimented cautiously in dim office rooms, patients who reported new ways of feeling. They moved through the world with the slow attentiveness of people who believed that the map of the mind could be updated by careful, modest interventions. The rest of the century would test that belief in ways they could not yet imagine. But in those early years, the arc from a Merck patent page to a private therapy session had an almost literary grace. A quiet passage from industrial anonymity to intimate use, mediated by chemistry, curiosity, and a shared conviction that some molecules, if handled wisely, might enlarge the human capacity for connection. When MDMA first eased its way into psychotherapy offices in the 1970s, it arrived like a small, polite guest. No trumpet, no billboard, just a crystalline promise in a chemist's vial that hinted something older than jargon and newer than law. Therapists, already apprenticed to the strange labour of coaxing truth from reticence, found in that molecule an unusual instrument. It lowered the armour around memory and feeling. It made words come easier. It softened the head's defences so that pain could be touched rather than defended against. People in sober suits and soft chairs began to call it Adam, a private nickname meant to return the mouth to a simpler vocabulary. Innocence, beginning, the primal capacity to speak without the immediate armour of shame. The name was practical and discreet. It anonymised the compound in a way that felt ethical to many of those early clinicians, and protective to their patients. Alexander Shulgin's name often comes first in these histories, because he moved in circles that bridged chemistry and a quiet, responsible enthusiasm for altered states. He had the laboratory mind. He catalogued the molecule's effects, and when the time came, passed samples around to people he trusted. It was one thing for a synthetic to exist on paper. It was another for a therapist to sit in a living room by a lamp and watch someone draw a long breath and begin to tell the story of their life without the habitual defences. Leo Zeff, a California psychologist with a reputation for unorthodox but humane methods, became the most evangelical of those clinicians. Zeff taught small groups in the late 1970s and early 1980s in Private Workshop, a pragmatic travelling school, describing how a single session with the drug could create a space where marital patterns, childhood ghosts, and untreated trauma might be seen and transformed. He called it Adam. He taught others to call it Adam too, whispering the name like a charm against publicity and politicised panic. The practice was artisanal. Therapy rooms were made intentionally less clinical. Couches, soft throws, dim lamps, a record player or cassette deck cued with music chosen for tone rather than trend. A co-therapist often sat on a folding chair just out of the patient's sightline, not because sessions required a circus of clinicians, but because safety felt like good protocol when you were working with anything that could amplify vulnerability. Dosing guidance came from an empirical, almost oral tradition. Around 100 milligrams was a commonly cited starting point, an amount that reliably softened anxiety without hurling the sitter into a full psychedelic disassociation. Half-hourly tea breaks, a possible booster dose later if intensity fell. Long stretches of listening, sometimes silence. Sometimes the patient talked for hours, and when talk trembled into sobs, the therapist simply sat with the loss, letting it be spoken in a way it had not been spoken before. The therapeutic applications read like a clinical catalogue of human stubbornness and suffering. Couples who had stopped talking about sexual history or shame found, under Adam, the vocabulary to say the things that had calcified around a marriage. Survivors of abuse sometimes found, in the warm gravity of the drug, the capacity to tell without re-traumatizing themselves. Veterans and people folded into complex post-traumatic patterns found a route through the fearful architecture of memory. Not always, and not cleanly, but sometimes in ways that clinic notes then described as breakthroughs. These were clinical anecdotes, not randomized double-blind evidence. The clinicians who used Adam knew that. They documented case histories in journals and trade newsletters. They wrote long letters and traded protocols at conferences and over coffee. But the scaffolding of controlled trials simply did not yet exist. Those early accounts were vivid, often ecstatic in their modesty. Phil Wolfson and George Greer, physicians who moved between psychiatric practice and the fringe of controlled experimentation, published some of the first small-scale clinical descriptions in the 1980s. They and others described increased affect tolerance, reduced fear response, and an unusual capacity for patients to recount painful episodes without disintegration. The literature read like the field notes of midwives attending births of feeling. Yet with every paragraph of testimony there was an asterisk. These were uncontrolled observations, steeped in therapist judgment. There were no placebos, no blinded raters, no systematic measurement of long-term outcomes beyond the therapist's own notes. Enthusiasm outpaced evidence. Human need is a good engine for conviction. It is a poor substitute for rigour. Ethical boundaries, always a complicated fabric in psychotherapy, grew thin in some pockets. Before a molecule becomes a headline and then a statute, the legal atmosphere can be porous, allowing practices to drift into grey zones that later look naive or culpable. Many clinicians used MDMA in a time when it was not yet scheduled as a controlled substance in the United States, a brief, fragile grace that encouraged experimentation without clear regulatory oversight. Some practitioners did get institutional review board approval for limited studies, but much of the work happened off books in the scene between innovation and regulation. Consent forms existed and were signed, sometimes they were the only thing standing between a clinician and prosecution. Others trusted a community ethic, do no harm and do a lot of listening. There were also darker contours to that informality. Suggestibility is a powerful and often unappreciated thing. The person under the influence of a compound that lowers fear and increases trust can be more absorbent of suggestion, more susceptible to narrative shaping from the therapist who is trying, with earnestness, to create meaning out of fractured histories. Questions of memory contamination became real, not theoretical, when recollections retrieved in MDMA sessions later shaped legal testimony or family narratives. A therapist's authority can be therapeutic. It can also be dangerous. Rumours and then reports of boundary violations surfaced, as they do in any therapeutic community that deals with extreme vulnerability. Sexual misconduct, coercion, or even the misuse of a special therapeutic context to pursue personal intimacy with a patient were not unheard of. The ethical debates that followed were messy, pained, and necessary. How to protect the person who's most naked in a room when therapeutic practice is experimenting with tools that make nakedness easier to achieve. Then the molecule migrated, the way ideas and tools do when people move between worlds. From clinics in the San Francisco Bay Area and the quieter studios of suburban therapists, MDMA slipped into bars, bedrooms, and private parties. A client, feeling lighter after a session, might bring the compound home. A therapist trainee, curious about community rather than cure, might offer a pill at a friend's dinner party. The earliest recreational exchanges were unglamorous and human. A powder wrapped in wax paper passed between people who trusted one another. By the early 80s, the compound had names beyond Adam. Some people called it ecstasy, a word that advertised its promise rather than its provenance, and others used shorthand, XTC, that made it sound like a secret password. Language has weight. The shift from Adam to ecstasy was itself a cultural turning point. Adam implied therapeutic origin and caution. Ecstasy invited celebration. The molecule fitted nightlife easily. Where LSD promised landscapes and peyote promised myth, MDMA promised people. It did not insist that you stare at your own belly or climb into cosmic metaphor. It allowed you to face the person beside you and mean it. In dim rooms where strangers shaved hours off their days to the precise discipline of dance, what people wanted most, both then and now, was connection. An MDMA lubricated conversation, softened social friction, and magnified euphoria. Nightlife is, at its base, a social technology. Where you used to need alcohol to burn down the hedges between bodies, MDMA offered a different route. Clarity instead of fog, empathy instead of bravado. It was less about losing oneself and more about finding someone else to belong to for a night. Markets rose to meet that wanting. Initially, small networks traded pills hand to hand. Then came the pill culture. Stamped tablets with simple logos, a kind of brand architecture for a thing that was otherwise illicit and dangerous. The logos served multiple purposes. They were marketing, they were reassurance, and they were an attempt to give an unreliable supplier coherent identity. A buyer could point to a Mitsubishi or a smiley face and say, with imperfect faith, "That's the one my friend had." Producers in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands and Germany, scaled up clandestine manufacture through the 1980s and 90s. The relative permissiveness of some jurisdictions, combined with deep chemical know-how in certain labs, created a manufacturing corridor that fed club scenes across Europe and beyond. By the time drug control agencies began to clamp down in earnest, the recreational market had already metastasized. Pills, powders, and later crystalline MDMA travelled by plane, ferry and freight, often concealed within legal goods, sometimes folded into the economy of small criminal networks, sometimes sold openly enough in certain neighborhoods that the police and the public lived in a tense, negotiated ignorance. Word of MDMA's social alchemy moved faster than the slow gears of science. People told each other stories of the night when a couple's long unspoken grievance disintegrated into tears and laughter, of the party where friends reconciled under flashing lights, of congregations of people who suddenly felt less lonely. Those stories were contagious. They travelled in letters on college campuses into the clubs of New York, the basements of London, the bars of Berlin. The street names multiplied as the drug shed its clinic skin and grew a nightlife face. Ecstasy, XEXTC, and later Molly, a term that would come to mean crystalline, supposedly pure MDMA in the American lexicon of the 2000s. The names were not merely linguistic, they signalled shifts in how the substance was understood and who it belonged to. If the 70s and early 1980s were the molecule's apprenticeship in therapy rooms, the late 80s opened a new chapter in which MDMA became an engine of cultural formation. Acid house music, itself a transplant from Chicago's underground in the mid-1980s, found a spiritual kin in the effects of MDMA. The squelching bass lines and repetitive motifs produced by the Roland TB-303 spoke to the same appetite for rhythmic trance that MDMA amplified in the human body. It is hardly accidental that some of the earliest and most visible encounters between the drug and mass nightlife occurred around clubs and destinations where sound, light, and bodies were already experimenting with ecstatic states. Ibiza plays a moderate-sized mythic role here. British DJs and club-goers who travelled to the Balearic Island in the mid to late 1980s found a permissive, late-night scene in which DJs spun disparate sounds and crowd culture was less rigid. They returned to Britain with more than new records. They brought back a style of clubbing and, crucially, a social habit. Danny Rampling, Paul Oakenfold, Nicky Holloway and others are names that appear in the lore for having imported the Balearic vibe to London's underground in 1987 and 1988. Rampling opened Shoom in 1987, a small, sweaty club that became a locus for the acid house movement and, incidentally, for the social effects of ecstasy. The Hacienda in Manchester, already an urban landmark thanks to Factory Records and New Order, turned into another epicentre for the new sound and the new drug. Then came the second summer of love, 1988-1989, when that particular chemistry, musical and chemical, detonated in a way that made the phrase rave culture part of the public lexicon. The aesthetic was distinct. Flyers for acid house nights often featured the Pamiley face icon, which became a wry insignia. It was fun, emblematic, a bright smudge of optimism against the otherwise greying political skies of Thatcher-era Britain. The smiley was a joke and a manifesto. We are here to dance, to be kind, to lose suspicion. On the dance floor, MDMA encouraged tender contact, hands on shoulders, strangers hugged as if known, conversations that would have been impossible at the bar in sober times flowed like warm tea. The club became a small experimental utopia each weekend, a temporary community stitched together by scent, sound, sweat, and a willingness to be more honest than the week allowed. Across the channel and over the continent, regional variations cropped up. Berlin's scene, especially after the fall of the wall in 1989, took a particular shape. The city had empty spaces and a yearning to assemble them into new forms of social life. The Love Parade, begun in 1989 by Dr. Motte, grew from a few hundred techno-devotees into a rolling carnival that drew hundreds of thousands. In Amsterdam and Rotterdam, the commercial club infrastructure meshed with a tolerant cultural policy that allowed techno and dance to endure as visible, if contested, parts of civic life. In Germany and the Netherlands, policing and public health responses differed from Britain's more punitive turn. In practical terms, that meant that raves evolved on different schedules and with different acceptances in municipal life. It would be dishonest to pretend the dance floor was always a safe harbour. The same properties that made MDMA socially lubricating could also be physiologically treacherous when mixed with crowded, overheated rooms and poor information. Dehydration, hypothermia, and too deep copies of the wrong chemical in a pill could cause hospitals to be crowded in ways that terrified politicians and journalists. In the early 1990s, a handful of high-profile incidents led to sensational headlines, and moral panic became policy. Britain's Castle Morton Common Festival in May 1992, a massive, unsanctioned outdoor event that drew tens of thousands over several days, was pivotal. The festival became a touchstone for political actors who wanted to clamp down on unlicensed gatherings, and the subsequent Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994 contained language strange for a statute. It specifically targeted music characterised by the emission of a succession of repetitive beats. That oddly musical phrasing made the law a legal blunt instrument aimed squarely at the rave scene. It worked to criminalise certain forms of communal musical gathering and pushed many events further underground. In the United States, the trajectory was different but related. Warehouse parties in cities like New York, Detroit and Chicago were already channels for techno and house music. MDMA fit well into those nights. The US never produced a single cultural law like Britain's repetitive beats clause, but local ordinances, policing strategies and high-profile media coverage had similar chilling effects, driving some gatherings away from mainstream visibility and into something more clandestine. American rave culture took on its own mythic codes: PLUR, peace, love, unity, respect, becoming a slogan in some circles, the ethos of community and care becoming a patchwork response to legal and social hostility. The idea that ravers should look out for one another, handing water, calling for help, checking on a stranger, was partly an organic ethic and partly a harm reduction response to the very real risks of crowded, chemically enhanced nights. That language of harm reduction deserves emphasis because it showed how cultures adapt when criminal penalties and public health crises collide. Grassroots organisations began to form in the 90s and beyond. Volunteer crews who handed out water, staffed chill-out zones, or provided reagent testing kits so that the pills people were taking could be chemically screened on site. They were not always welcomed by authorities, but they filled a practical need. The paradox is plain. Prohibition breeds unregulated markets, and unregulated markets create hazards that pragmatic people then have to mitigate outside official channels. The story of MDMA in the late 20th century is, in microcosm, the story of that paradox. Globally, the dance explosion rewired social calendars. Festivals became international nodes where styles, drugs and people mixed and remixed. The Love Parade, the Hacienda Nights, Ibiza's boat parties, Castle Morton's chaos, they were story points where the culture condensed. They were also epidemiological nodes, places where new patterns of use, new pill styles and new social norms could spread rapidly. In Istanbul, Sao Paulo, Sydney and Taipei, local iterations of club culture took on distinct meanings. In some cities, ecstasy became a club owner's friend in keeping customers dancing until dawn. In others, it folded into youth subcultures as a symbol of resistance against conservative social mores. The same molecule collected different semiosis, meanings and values as it moved through different moral economies. And the production side shifted too. As demand ballooned, manufacturers refined production techniques, and pills became more varied, both in active content and in presentation. Adulteration became a constant risk. Later decades would see reports of tablets containing speed, synthetic cathinones, PMA and PMMA, compounds that can be more dangerous in certain contexts, or simply inert binders advertised as pure MDMA. The 1990s and 2000s were a time of constant chemical churn. For many consumers, the main strategy were peer reputation. If a friend bought a particular batch and it seemed fine, that was social proof. For others, harm reduction groups and community testing offered a method to reduce risk. For policymakers, however, the solution continued to be primarily punitive, and that choice shaped markets more than it controlled them. The cultural irony not lost on historians and participants alike is that a molecule introduced as an adjunct to intimacy and therapy helped to build movements that were nominally about connection and communal transcendence, and yet that very shift into mass culture invited criminalization, commodification, and, ultimately, the coarsening of some of its initial impulses. The therapeutic Adam became the nightlife ecstasy, and ecstasy then took on the mercantile habits of any successful commodity: branding, supply chains, counterfeiters, and a secondary market of health advice and harm reduction. Music and drugs co-evolved in those rooms and fields. The DJ's setlist and the pill's timing became a coordinated craft, with DJs learning when to slow the tempo, when to bring in a softer track, and dancers learning how to regulate their bodies through a long night. By the end of the 20th century, MDMA was no longer a clinical curiosity confined to small, careful networks of therapists. It had become a global cultural vector, altering how the young people planned evenings, how cities allocated copious police resources on weekends, and how public health agencies framed harm. The molecule catalyzed rituals, preloading conversations, the hand-to-hand exchange of pills, the warm afterglow, chats in the small hours. Rituals that, in their gentleness and sometimes in their recklessness, reconfigured communal life in ways both small and resonant. If one looks back with the patience of a historian and the softness of a storyteller, the path MDMA traced between therapy room and dance floor feels almost inevitable. Humans will take tools that heal and experiment with their social uses. Humans will then legislate against what scares them. Humans will adapt, inventing clandestine economies, grassroots care systems, and new meanings all at once. The tale is not one of simple corruption or simple salvation. It is instead a long, windy story of needs, markets, laws, music, and those strange social inventions we call rituals. In that sense, Adam's journey from couch to club is a parable about modernity, an experiment in how we try to ease the burden of being together, how we try to feel less alone, and how the very instruments we employ to heal can also be folded into entirely different economies of pleasure and risk. The music kept playing, people kept dancing, the molecule kept teaching, and the world kept, in the most human way, trying to find each other. The late 1980s closed over MDMA like a long, slow shutter. Newspapers, hungry for simple stories and sharp pictures, found a face for fear, a smiling, pill-shaped symbol that could be set against the neon of a club or the pale light of a mortuary. Television cut between sweating bodies at a warehouse party and the solemn corridors of hospitals. Print ran photographs of youths collapsed on lawns and of paramedics leaning over them. And somewhere between the two a new lexicon was born. Rave plague, brain bleach, zombie drug, language that was designed to stop the eye and speed the heart. It was efficient storytelling for a frightened era. The Cold War had thawed, but government still needed enemies, and the glittering communal spaces of youth culture provided a convenient target. The moral panic did not arrive fully formed. It was assembled in studios and editorial rooms, in the offices of politicians and the meetings of advocacy groups, in the emergency wards where a handful of tragedies were reported in headlines as if they were an epidemic, and then told again until the story became the thing it described. There was a pattern to the reporting. A death at a party would be attributed to ecstasy before toxicology was finished. An observational correlation would be spoken of as causation. An animal model would be treated as a mirror reflecting the human condition. This pattern was not purely sloppiness. It was a social mechanism. Stanley Cohen's work on moral panics had taught that societies under strain look for folk devils, the figure of the mindless youth or the drugged outsider, and the press obligingly supplied them. In the case of MDMA, that folk devil was made both small and monstrous. A small white pill that could, according to the headlines, melt wiring in a child's brain and send death trickling through dance floors like a fever. Politicians learned the trick quickly. Photos of parents mourning and of rowdy raves provided theatrical canvases on which to paint urgency. A frightened public demanded action. Political actors who had been looking for a plausible pretext to spend more on policing and to show decisiveness in the war on drugs found a ready-made rationale. Their moral panic fed policy, and policy fed more panic. Underneath the sound bites and front pages, there was a scientific conversation, far more careful, tentative and messy than the media afforded it. Beginning in the mid to late 1980s, neuroscientists reported that certain regimens of MDMA could produce long-lasting changes in serotonergic systems in laboratory animals. Researchers working with rodents and non-human primates observed, under conditions designed to model heavy or repeated exposure, reduced markers associated with serotonin neurons. Names like Thomas E. Ricorte became associated with those studies in the public mind, because some of the early experiments were striking and easily sensationalized. Pictures of stained brain tissue could be placed alongside clinical warnings and a narrative of impending epidemic. Yet the translation from lab to lay press skipped critical steps. The doses that produced measurable neurochemical changes in animals were often high relative to what a typical human user consumed. Ambient conditions such as forced hypothermia during experiments altered outcomes. Route and frequency of exposure differed, and the simple fact that a laboratory animal's brain is not a human brain, not in complexity, not in context, was frequently erased in everyday retellings. Two sorts of error did most of the heavy lifting in the panic. The first was the error of extrapolation, drawing a straight arrow from neurochemical change in a rat at a high dose to permanent brain damage in young clubgoers. The second was the error of omission, leaving out the confounding realities of polydrug use, pre-existing medical vulnerabilities, and circumstances at events, overcrowding, dehydration and heat that could worsen outcomes. When combined with the human appetite for clear villains and simple causes, those errors created a narrative that was hard to dislodge. The science itself was not unanimous. Some researchers reported more modest effects. Some found reversible changes, and others worried that the early media headlines were flattening nuance into moral panic. But nuance did not sell newspapers. Panic did. Advocacy groups and politicians amplified the story. Parent coalitions, conservative think tanks, and law and order politicians found a common script. An image of youth culture out of control, aided and abetted by a deceptively benign-sounding name and a small, inexpensive pill. The rhetoric moved quickly from danger to plague. Ministers of the Interior, congressional committees and parliamentary debates took on a moral tone. Cameras favoured the outraged over the dispassionate. In the United Kingdom, the rising visibility of free parties and warehouse raves intersected with a Conservative government anxious about public order. In local councils across the North and Midlands, magistrates and chiefs of police began to demand new powers. In the United States, the language of crisis fit neatly into an expanding war on drugs, giving members of Congress and the executive branch a political opening to argue for emergency measures and for punitive responses rather than for a public health approach that might have emphasised prevention and harm reduction. That panic made for expedient policy, and expedient policy does not always follow the lights of evidence. In the atmosphere of alarm, uncertainty became a reason for decisive action rather than a cause for careful study. Emergency scheduling, rapid criminalisation, and heavy-handed law enforcement were easier to sell than long-burnished investments in clinical research or in on-site harm reduction at festivals. The consequences were practical and long-lasting. Research funding, ethics approvals, and the administrative hurdles necessary to study a controlled substance shrank the pool of investigators willing to work on MDMA, and therapists who had already been experimenting with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy before the crackdown, cautious and committed clinicians trying to help people with treatment-resistant trauma, were forced either to cease their work or to carry it out in the shadows. Evidence-based policy-making, which requires time, patient data collection, and collaboration between clinicians and regulators, was shoved to the margins by a drumbeat that demanded swift, visible control. Criminalisation arrived not as a single tidy law, but as a concatenation of administrative moves, scheduling hearings, and international pressures that together narrowed legal and clinical possibilities. In the United States, the Drug Enforcement Administration moved in the mid-1980s to place MDMA under the strictest controls. Emergency scheduling relegated it to a class of substances described as having little or no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. That administrative decision had ripple effects. A formal process followed of petitions, hearings, and eventually litigation. But the default assumption of many regulators had shifted. MDMA would be treated like heroin or LSD, not like an experimental psychotherapy adjunct. In the administrative hearings that followed, some voices from inside the system pushed back. An administrative law judge, applied to the record of therapeutic use and the limited evidence of dependence, suggested that a middle path might be more appropriate, that rescheduling to allow restricted medical use could enable research and supervision. The judge's careful, evidence-oriented recommendation was overridden by agency leaders under pressure from public and political forces. The result was legal closure around MDMA that lasted decades. Clinical investigators now faced an arduous path to permissions, and many pragmatic therapists who had used the substance as a tool in tightly controlled settings decided that the legal risk was too great. That closure had more than symbolic consequences. Schedule I-style classifications place the weight of proof on those who had researched therapeutic use. They require rigorous security, expensive licensing, and a procurement chain that was essentially criminalized overnight. Materials had to be sourced from licensed manufacturers, but few manufacturers were willing or able to supply investigational batches, and those that did often demanded bureaucratic redundancy that chilled small research projects. Grants were harder to secure because review panels were reluctant to fund work that might be politically fraught or operationally infeasible. The net effect was a lull in legitimate clinical inquiry that lasted for years. For patients, for the veterans with treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder, for couples and individuals struggling with entrenched relational pain. The promise that had been visible in handfuls of pre-85 therapeutic reports was put on hold. It would take the patient persistence of activists, a remaking of scientific protocols, and many years before carefully controlled clinical trials could proceed again. The criminal law response also reshaped the social topography of MDMA use. Before heavy criminal sanctions took hold, MDMA had lived in a cultural seam between psychotherapy and club life. It had been, in certain corners, an adjunct to clinical practice and a facilitator of communion in social spaces. Once criminalized, the substance was pushed into less supervised environments. Older users who had used MDMA in therapy retreated. Younger users gravitated toward parties and clubs where policing and anonymity made distribution easier to sell. Supply chains adapted accordingly. What had sometimes been a small-scale, friendship-based sharing of a substance that was seldom branded, and even more seldom sold in industrial quantities, began to develop the features of a market. Production scaled up, pills were pressed in large batches, distributors sought to differentiate their products with images and logos, and reputations were both economic capital and a form of consumer protection. Under prohibition, reputation can act as a substitute for regulation. A consistently well-dosed leisure product could sell through word of mouth the same way a trusted brand once did. This shift set the scene for a change that historians and policymakers still argue about: prohibition's role in altering risk. In a controlled therapeutic setting, doses are measured, the subject is screened, and the environment is monitored. In the margins of a festival, doses are anecdotal, pills can contain unknown combinations, and environmental stressors are omnipresent. Criminalization did not extinguish use. It changed its character. It created incentives for scale and secrecy that encouraged organized groups to enter the trade, and it placed dealers and consumers in conflict with law enforcement in ways that often distracted attention from the structural problems, heat, crowding, poor information, that drive harm. As the market hardened, the clandestine manufacture of MDMA evolved with economic logic as its engine. Small amateur syntheses that had once been possible in hobbyist chemistry setups gave way in some regions to industrial-scale operations. The transformation was not uniform, it was uneven, opportunistic, and shaped by geography and law. In the late 1980s and through the 1990s, Western Europe, most notably the Netherlands and Belgium, emerged as production hubs. There were reasons beyond geography. A dense chemical industry relatively lacks oversight in certain districts, the availability of skilled labour and distribution networks, and ports that could move goods quickly. Criminal entrepreneurs found that the returns on pill production, when sold to a hungry market in the United Kingdom, Germany, or Scandinavia, were substantial. Producers clustered where they could access precursor chemicals and where enforcement was less likely to discover them quickly. The supply chain lengthened, and with length came layers of intermediaries, from chemical brokers to pressers to distributors. Precursors were the raw material of that chain, and controlling precursors became a central focus of law enforcement. Initially, oils and extracts derived from plants, sassafras and other fragrant trees, were major sources for the aromatic chemical building blocks used by clandestine chemists. As governments and international bodies moved to regulate and monitor those raw materials, suppliers adapted. They sought alternative chemical routes, shifted procurement to less regulated markets, or re-imported precursors through front companies and shadowed supply lines. This dynamic fueled a cat-and-mouse game. When one chemical was controlled, laboratories shifted to another pathway, or sourced reagents from countries with looser oversight. Commerce adapted faster than policy. For a while, the Netherlands remained a kernel of production because the logistical advantages outweighed the risks. Huge underground laboratories could be dismantled one by one, but new ones would appear in less expected locales. With scaling came professionalization. Pill presses replaced the irregular shapes of homemade tablets. Branding became an economic strategy. A stamped logo on a pill, a three-diamond motif, a superhero emblem, a stylized letter, acted as a crude certification of dosage and reputation. Dealers would advertise the source, and consumers, in the absence of formal regulatory agencies, learned to rely on image and word of mouth. The brands were facades over fragile quality control processes, but they mattered. A stable brand could command a higher price and reduce the risk of consumer dissatisfaction that might otherwise cut into profit margins. There was a paradox here. Prohibition encouraged secrecy and illegality, but market logic pushed toward predictability and trust. Criminal enterprises developed their own internal quality norms, sometimes making adulteration less likely and sometimes, for the sake of profit, encouraging substitution. Adulteration was an ever-present danger. For reasons of cost, access, or simple deception, pills frequently contained other compounds. Related amphetamine analogues, methamphetamine, or more dangerous substitutes like PMA or PMMA, whose pharmacological profiles could be lethal when taken on the assumption that they were MDMA. These substitutions were not always malicious. Sometimes they were the result of a bad batch, a mislabeled precursor, or an inexperienced synthesis that produced different alkaloid outcomes. But the public consequences were dramatic. Clusters of deaths, young people collapsing at parties after taking a pill that turned out to be something more dangerous, fed media narratives and political responses, which in turn intensified enforcement. Those deaths sometimes crystallized into strong immediate policy actions, raids, international requests for extradition, and high-profile seizures. The circularity was hard to escape. A few tragedies inflamed the media inflamed politicians, politicians empowered police pressure made markets more secretive and hazardous, and the cycle repeated. Law enforcement responses matured and internationalized. National agencies began to cooperate more closely. Europol and Interpol provided platforms for cross-border investigations. Bilateral relationships grew between the United States and European police forces. The interception of precursor shipments became a key tool. Some operations were spectacular in scale: container seizures at ports, coordinated raids across countries, and financial investigations aimed at nets of laundering and export. These operations were often successful in dismantling particular labs and in seizing caches of pills that were intended for festival circuits. But the economics of a decentralized market meant that supply could reroute, often to countries with weaker controls or to clandestine networks willing to take more risk. The effort and resources required to keep up with an adaptive illicit industry were substantial. Enforcement had to choose where to concentrate, and those choices shaped the market's evolution. By the late 90s and into the 2000s, the market had another axis of change: technology. The internet and later encrypted messaging and cryptocurrencies provided new avenues for distribution that were harder to police in traditional ways. Dark web marketplaces that would later develop, Silk Road and its successors, offered anonymity for buyers and sellers, a feedback mechanism through ratings, and a new means of reputation building divorced from the stamp of a pressed pill. These markets did not remove risk, but they altered it. Packaging, routing, and payment systems evolved towards smaller, more frequent shipments, and enforcement found itself in a new domain of cyber investigation. Public health responses in parallel adapted in ways that reflected local political cultures. In some countries, the Netherlands famously among them, harm reduction strategies were part of a pragmatic approach: festival medical tents, free water, and an openness to testing and information. In others, public health measures were subordinated to zero-tolerance enforcement, and harm reduction initiatives had to operate in a legal grey zone. Grassroots organisations emerged to fill gaps: volunteers with reagent kits, or later, more sophisticated chromatographic tools who offered testing at festivals and who counselled about dose, hydration, and heat. Groups such as Dance Safe in the United States and Energy Control in Spain pioneered community-level interventions that recognised the realities of use, rather than pretending they could eliminate it. Those programs often found themselves at odds with police, who feared that testing would be perceived as condoning illegal behaviour. The tension between harm reduction and enforcement encapsulated the larger failure of the panic era. A public policy conversation that might once have asked how to reduce harm through evidence instead asked only how to reduce supply through law. The illicit market's technical and economic evolution had predictable public health consequences. Where purity and predictable dosing improved, some risks diminished. Fewer overdoses from accidental high doses, more predictable effects for consumers who could trust a brand. When new synthetic possibilities or substitutes entered the supply, the opposite followed: sudden waves of adverse events, fatalities, and renewed panic. The market's inherent paradox, that it both produced and managed risk, while simultaneously magnifying it through secrecy and scale, made it an intractable policy problem. Policymakers who demanded total elimination of use found themselves forced into an endless chase. Those who advocated for a more pragmatic approach, decriminalisation, regulated markets, or robust harm reduction systems, were often shouted down by the visceral imagery of the Rave plague, a phrase which had done its job well. It simplified a complex social phenomenon into a horror story that elected officials could use as a short-term instrument of control. The story of MDMA's illicit trade is therefore as much a story about institutions as about chemistry. It is the tale of how different actors adapted to constraints: entrepreneurs seeking profit, policymakers seeking votes, scientists seeking truth in ambiguous data, therapists seeking to help, and patients and partygoers seeking relief or joy in embodied ways. It is a story that winds through port towns and suburban clinics, through clandestine laboratories and university IRBs, and across the quiet offices where funding decisions are made. When the panic eased and the scientific community regained some of its footing, it became possible to re-examine MDMA's risks and potential benefits with a clearer lens. But by then the markets had changed, the criminal structures had hardened, and a generation of potential therapeutic users had been deprived of access to regulated clinical pathways. In the end, the moral panic, the criminalisation, and the black market evolution were knitted together. Panic made it politically easy to criminalize. Criminalization drove markets into secrecy and scale. Market secrecy generated dangerous variability and tragedies that, in turn, fed panic. Policy, commerce, and culture became braided. It is a cautionary braid. When a society responds to anxiety by rushing to ban and punish, it can create the very conditions that make the problem harder to manage and often more dangerous than it might otherwise have been. The irony is not small. A pill that had once been discussed in therapeutic circles as a controlled instrument of healing became an emblem of emergency governance, and that governance slowed the science that might have clarified the limits and possibilities of the drug more rapidly. Through the 90s and into the new century, the human story of MDMA continued on two parallel tracks. One track carried the heavy boots of interdiction, raids, indictments, and high-profile court battles that made headlines and fed the blandishments of moral certainty. The other carried quiet clinical persistence and grassroots harm reduction, patient advocates who argued for research licenses, and volunteer groups that tested pills in festival parking lots, handing out water and quiet counsel. The market continued to innovate in response to enforcement. The policy community, sometimes slowly and sometimes reluctantly, came to appreciate that evidence and care could not be fast-forwarded simply by proclamation. If there is a small consolation in this history, it is that the final verdict was never written entirely by headline writers. The scientific community, pushed and constrained, adapted by developing new protocols, stricter safeguards, and better designed studies. Activists who had been caricatured as apologists or naifs evolved into rigorous petitioners for clinical oversight. Organisations like MAPS persisted in litigating, fundraising and designing trials. Gradually, after decades in the wilderness, research began to reclaim space in institutional medicine. That reclamation carries its own complexities and ironies, but it also suggests a modest moral. Policy built on fear produces brittle solutions. Policy built on patient curiosity and care builds more durable ones. The streets, the clubs, the labs, and the courtrooms all bear witness to that lesson, and the residue of the rave plague rhetoric still hums in public memory, a cautionary noise against which clearer, calmer judgments must ultimately be made. When Molly arrived as a promise, crystalline, white, modern, it did so with the soft confidence of a new brand, a name that suggested chemistry, intimacy, and domesticity all at once, a nickname that folded molecular into a nickname and made the illicit sound tidy. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, as electronic dance music festivals went from subcultural circuits to stadium spectacles in cities from Miami to Manchester, dealers and distributors learned a simple piece of marketing. People will pay a premium to believe they have something purer. Molly was sold in small Ziplocs and little foil sachets, sometimes stamped with logos, sometimes accompanied by a selfie of the vendor's product laid out like rock candy under fluorescence. The visual language was deliberate. Crystals, clean typography, sleek Instagram posts, an aesthetic meant to reassure. Powder, many users said to one another, meant molecular. Pills were for the old, riskier world of unreliable stamping. The myth of purity took on a life of its own. It was a myth that had industrial logistics on its side. When ecstasy first moved from pressed tablets to more crystalline forms, supply chains shifted. Clandestine chemists who had access to pure MDMA freebase learned to press and crystallize, and then market the output as an elevated boutique product. In the same way that craft beer rebranded beer as artisanal, Molly rebranded MDMA as refined. The distribution networks, small labs in Mexico, aging chemistry cells in Europe, clandestine kitchens in Southeast Asia, responded to demand with packaging and narrative rather than chemistry. Aesthetics created expectations, expectations shaped behaviour. Reality, as it tended to, was messier. Adulteration was not a bug in the market so much as a persistent design feature. When the supply of true MDMA waxed and waned, the vendors who remained did what human economies have always done. They substituted. PMA and PMMA, Paramethoxyamphetamine and paramethoxymethamphetamine were among the more sinister of these stand-ins. Chemically cousins to MDMA, they share some serotonergic effects, but differ importantly in kinetics. They tend to come on more slowly and, at the same time, drive body temperature in dangerous ways. A person expecting the quick rise of MDMA who instead ingests a slow-acting PMA can, impatient, take more compounding toxicity. PMA has been implicated for decades in festival deaths and hospitalizations across Europe and Australasia. The first wave that drew serious regulatory attention and forensic scrutiny was not the social media era, but the late 90s and early 2000s, when forensic toxicologists began to identify PMA in post-mortem samples in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, forcing a reckoning. A pill stamped with a familiar logo could be something chemically alien. The story of synthetic cathinones, the so-called bath salts family, is equally instructive. Names like mephedrone, methylone, MDPV, N-ethylpentalone, read like an index of chemistry students' late-night experiments. In practice, they acted as cheap stimulatory substitutes for MDMA. Methylone, for instance, some clandestine chemists marketed as a powder that mimics the entactogenic buzz of MDMA, but with a shorter duration and a more jittery edge. Because these cathinones were freshly synthesized and often marketed to exploit regulatory gaps, they could be sold under the banner of Molly to unwary consumers who assumed a single neat chemical, when in fact they were buying a patchwork of designer drugs. In North America and parts of Europe the mid-2010s, there were concerted forensic analyses showing that a non-trivial fraction of Molly samples were something else, methylone, mephedrone, or blends of stimulants and empathogens. The streak could be clever, law enforcement and public health struggled to keep up. There were two oddities and cruelties of supply: small amounts of methamphetamine or caffeine added to cut a product, benzodiazepines mixed into pills to produce a harsher, numbing come-down, and, more recently, the intrusion of opioids, including fentanyl, into unexpected corners of the illicit market. Fentanyl contamination has been most devastating in the opioid realm, but the drug's ubiquity in criminal supply chains means it occasionally turns up in drugs never meant to be opioids. Such contamination turns what is already a risky chemical encounter into a roulette of receptor mechanisms: serotonergic ecstasy, stimulant cathinone and opioid, all rolled into one. The result has been catastrophic at times, but the pattern is clearer than panicked headlines suggest. Adulteration is heterogeneous and geographically variable. It follows supply, policy, and the cheapness of precursors. The myths of purity were not merely aesthetic, they changed behaviour in measurable ways. Users who believed they had real MDMA sometimes felt safer taking larger doses, or dosing more frequently over a night. They mixed with other substances with less caution. They travelled farther to festivals with a sense that a crystalline powder was a guarantee of predictability. This sense of security could be lethal. Risk perception drives dosage decisions, and dosage decisions interact with environment. Crowded tents, high temperatures, long periods of dancing and minimal sleep to produce physiologic stress. When an adulterant like PMA enters that equation, the mismatch between expectation and reality becomes deadly. Policy responses to the surge of Molly-related anxieties were, as with many drug panics, a mixture of suppression and moralizing. In the United States, the DEA issued warnings. In Britain, tabloids screamed about the Molly menace. In places such as Australia and New Zealand, officials mounted publicity campaigns urging festival-goers to be careful or to seek help, while law enforcement focused on interdiction. But the more interesting and quieter movement came from below, from communities that had no faith that a punitive state project would keep people safe. Grassroots harm reduction organisations, some decades old, others born in the social media era, began to offer what the market and the regulators did not: access to information. Drug-checking services of many stripes emerged in response to the adulteration economy. In the tents behind festival stages, under fluorescent camping lights, volunteers and technicians set up reagent tests, simple colour change kits that could flag certain functional groups in a substance, and, when funding allowed, portable instrumentation like Fourier transform infrared spectrometers and occasionally gas chromatographs coupled with mass spectrometry. The early low-tech kits were imperfect but immediate. They told you, roughly, whether the powder on the table contained a functional group consistent with MDMA or something else. Later, the FTR machines, room-sized miracles of optics and signal processing, could give a more detailed readout, particularly useful when combined with spectra databases. Mobile labs appeared in Spain and the Netherlands. NGOs in Barcelona and Amsterdam began collaborating with festival organisers. Energy Control in Spain built relationships with event promoters to provide on-site testing. In the Netherlands, long-standing monitoring systems run by national health institutes provided a surveillance backbone that fed into public advisories. In the United Kingdom, emergent services started in the 2010s, offering discrete testing and anonymised reporting so that a broader epidemiology could be built. The logistics of testing are worth pausing on. A festival pill testing tent might resemble a community clinic rather than a circus attraction. A table, a tent, a couple of technicians in lab coats, a queue of people who surrender a pill or a pinch of powder, anonymity assured. Results are delivered verbally and often with harm reduction counselling. This substance contains methylone. Its onset is shorter. Reduced dose. This appears to be PMA. Do not take. Sometimes the news changes behaviour. Studies that looked at what people did after testing found heterogeneous responses. A significant share of people threw away their pills when told it was not MDMA. Others still used, sometimes rationalising that they could tolerate it or that it might be mostly MDMA anyway. The best programmes coupled testing with robust communication, clear, non-judgmental advice about dosing, hydration, cooling strategies, and when to seek medical help. That pragmatic posture, testing plus counselling, demonstrated a clear public health utility. In some regions, police and municipal authorities, recognising that their interests were in averting deaths rather than handing out citations, quietly tolerated or even endorsed pilot testing schemes. In others, legal prohibitions on possession meant testers themselves risked arrest, creating a paradox in which life-saving information was criminalised. Case studies illustrate the point starkly. Consider a sequence of festival hospitalisations in a European summer where 11 people presented with severe hypothermia and agitation. Toxicology resulted not in MDMA but in PMMA, and the slow onset of the drug had led several to redose before the toxic effects manifested, creating a cascade of overdoses. In another instance in the United States, an emergency department in an urban centre saw a cluster of young adults with acute sympathomimetic toxidrome. Very rapid heart rates, extreme agitation, seizures, and analysis revealed a mixture of methylone and amphetamine, packaged as Molly. These were not stories of a panacea gone wrong. They were stories of mislabelling, of supply-driven substitution, of an information asymmetry between seller and buyer. The presence of testing services in some of those contexts allowed clinicians and public health officials to tailor responses, warnings, targeted education, and temporary alerts, reducing the time between an unusual hospital cluster and an appropriate public advisory. If the story of adulteration is a tale about supply chains and myth-making, the story of harm is where chemistry meets the body and the narrative gets clinical and intimate. MDMA's acute risks are, in a sense, predictable from its pharmacology. The drug is a potent releaser of serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. It blocks reuptake and disrupts normal neurotransmitter dynamics. These neurochemical effects translate into physiological ones: increased heart rate and blood pressure, elevated body temperature, and a subjective surge of energy and sociability that is, for many, precisely the point. But the same mechanisms that produce euphoria also tax autonomic regulation. Hypothermia, the dangerous elevation of core body temperature, is the most dramatic acute hazard. A crowded, overheated tent with poor ventilation becomes a crucible. Vigorous dancing, dehydration, the insulating effect of clothing, and MDMA's interference with thermoregulatory processes create a synergy that can push a person into heat stroke and multi-organ failure. Paradoxically, hydration advice has its own trap. MDMA stimulates vasopressin antidiuretic hormone in some users, and there are sex differences in susceptibility. Women, by several series of case reports, have been overrepresented in fatal hyponatremia. Hyponatremia occurs when water intoxication dilutes sodium levels. A user worried about dehydration, repeatedly drinking large volumes of water while on MDMA, a drug that can increase ADH secretion, can drop serum sodium to dangerously low levels, causing cerebral edema, seizures, and death. The mid-2000s and 2010s were punctuated by case reports and reviews in medical journals cautioning clinicians and festival medics about this pitfall, advised to sip, not to guzzle, to attend to balance, not slogans. Other acute concerns are serotonin syndrome, which arises from excessive serotonergic activity and is most likely when MDMA is combined with other serotonergic drugs, MAO inhibitors, certain antidepressants, or when dosing is uncontrolled. Serotonin syndrome presents with hyperreflexia, clonus, agitation, and autonomic instability, and it overlaps clinically with malignant hypothermia. The management requires careful sedation, cooling, and sometimes blockers that attenuate serotonergic activity. Cardiac events, arrhythmias, myocardial infarction are rarer but real, especially in older users or those with undiagnosed structural heart disease. No discussion is complete without acknowledging polydrug use. Alcohol, stimulants like cocaine, opiates and benzodiazepines commonly accompany ecstasy use, complicating presentations and casualty management. The patient in the ED is often a tapestry of substances, not a single chemical history. Statistically, emergencies department data and forensic series paint a sobering but nuanced picture. Hospital visits related to MDMA are a small fraction of total drug-related visits in many developed countries, but they often attract outsized media attention because of their occurrence among young, otherwise healthy people with much to live for. Fatalities are rarer still, and when they happen, they are frequently complex, a triad of high dose, adverse environment, and either adulterant or polydrug interaction. This is important to say without sounding evasive. MDMA is not benign, nor is it uniformly lethal. Risk is context-dependent, graded by dose, environment, individual vulnerability, and the company of other drugs. Long-term concerns are messier, contested, and require methodological humility. Animal models, particularly rodent studies from the 1980s and 1990s, showed that high repeated doses of MDMA could produce lasting reductions in markers of serotonergic integrity, less serotonin in tissue assays, fewer identifiable terminals on histology. Those findings spelled out a biochemical possibility. MDMA could be neurotoxic to serotonin neurons in certain dosing regimens. Translating that to humans, however, is fraught. Species differences in metabolism, differences in dosing relative to body mass, and experimental conditions, forced hypothermia, repeated large boluses, make direct extrapolation perilous. Human research has been a battleground of mixed methods and contested claims. Cross-sectional neuropsychological studies often find that heavy, long-term MDMA users perform worse on verbal memory tasks than non-users. Some PET imaging studies report reduced serotonin transporter binding among chronic users. But correlation is not causation, and the field is peppered with confounds. Heavy MDMA users are more likely to use other psychoactive substances. They may differ premorbidly in impulsivity or educational attainment. Questionnaire-based estimates of lifetime dose are subject to recall bias, and analyses sometimes fail to control for these variables adequately. The result has been a steady procession of studies that, taken singly, point in contradictory directions. Two methodological problems in particular bedevil the literature. First is the problem of purity and dose. For decades, researchers could not be sure that a subject who reported taking MDMA had actually consumed MDMA rather than methylone or PMA or a hybrid mixture. That uncertainty confounds any attempt to tie cognitive findings to a specific molecule. Second is selection bias. Most cohort studies recruit from clubs, festivals, or treatment centres, populations that are not representative and are enriched for polydrug behaviour and for individuals who might already have cognitive or psychiatric vulnerabilities. Only a handful of true prospective longitudinal studies exist, ones that assess cognition prior to any exposure and then follow people forward. And these are the gold standard for establishing causality. Despite these limitations, some conclusions seem reasonably secure. Repeated high-dose exposure to MDMA is associated in some studies with persistent, though often modest, impairments in certain domains of memory and executive function. There is evidence that recovery occurs with abstinence in some people, but the timeline and completeness of recovery are variable. Mood disturbances, transient depression or anxiety in the days to weeks after use linked to serotonergic downregulation are well described clinically. Whether these translate into long-term psychiatric illness is less certain and likely individualized. Genetic moderators, such as polymorphisms in CYP2D6, the liver enzyme that contributes to MDMA metabolism, probably influence individual vulnerability. Slow metabolizers may accumulate higher levels of parent compound and metabolites and thus face greater risk from equivalent doses. These ambiguities are not just intellectual, they have policy consequences. A policy that treats MDMA as uniformly neurotoxic will push research away from nuanced, evidence-based interventions. A policy that minimizes risks will fail those individuals who, due to idiosyncratic biology or circumstances, suffer devastating harm. The right stance is empirical humility, recognize acute risks, pursue rigorous long-term studies, and design public health measures that reduce short-term harm while expanding scientific knowledge. Which brings us, gently but inexorably, to the structural impediments of research. MDMA's placement in Schedule 1 and in jurisdictions like the United States made early research arduous. Schedule I classification means, in bureaucratic terms, that the drug is treated as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. For researchers, that translated into years-long licensing processes, stringent storage requirements, and institutional reticence to pack the administrative load. Funding agencies, constrained by political winds and public sensibilities, were slow to underwrite high-quality clinical research into MDMA-assisted therapy or into the long-term neuropsychology of recreational use. The consequence was a patchwork literature with small samples, epidemiological holes, and a relative dearth of randomized controlled trials outside of therapeutic contexts. Controversies, too, thickened the air. High-profile animal studies in the late 90s and early 2000s claimed dramatic neurotoxic effects in primates. One such study later required correction when it was discovered that different substances had been administered, a debacle that fueled skepticism on both sides of the debate. The affair was embarrassing and instructive. It underscored the fragility of a literature that depends on scarce resources and on small teams labouring under political scrutiny. It also demonstrated how mistakes can be weaponized in policy debates, giving opponents of liberalized research a ready narrative and giving proponents reason to burnish their protocols. Yet science is adaptable. Methodological innovations have begun to soft-pedal those roadblocks. More sensitive PET ligands for serotonin transporters and receptors afford clearer, more specific imaging of serotonergic integrity. Longer-term prospective cohorts, some started in the Netherlands and Scandinavia in the early 2000s, have begun to collect baseline cognitive data and to follow incident users forward, giving stronger causal leverage. Wastewater epidemiology has emerged as a public health scale instrument. By sampling urban sewage and measuring drug metabolites, epidemiologists can infer population-level trends in MDMA use across cities and times, and correlate spikes with festival calendars and international supply chains. Hair and nail analyses offer retrospective biomarkers of exposure that are not reliant on self-report. Portable, field-ready mass spectrometers and improved FTIR databases make on-site drug checking more reliable. These are not panaceas, but they are tools that allow for finer-grained, less biased studies. A particularly consequential innovation has been the rigorous clinical trial pathway for MDMA as an adjunct to psychotherapy in treatment-resistant PTSD. This was not a government-led initiative, but the product of a decade of work by a private non-profit, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, led by Rick Doblin, which navigated the regulatory labyrinth to obtain investigational new drug approvals from the FDA, secured GMP-grade MDMA for trials, and implement randomized, double-blind protocols with careful safety monitoring. In 2017, the FDA granted breakthrough therapy designation to MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. Subsequent Phase 3 trials, reported in the early 2020s, suggested strong therapeutic signals for certain populations. The success of those trials had multiple downstream effects. They normalized, in the eyes of some regulators and funders, the idea that Schedule E substances could have legitimate medical utility. They demonstrated that rigorous protocols could limit harm and standardize dosing. And they created, for better or worse, a clinical pathway distinct from recreational use. The regulatory success of therapeutic MDMA research did not and could not resolve the larger public health challenges associated with recreational use. But it did loosen some constraints. Licensing pathways became clearer, institutional review boards more familiar with the unique risks and safeguards required, and pharmaceutical-grade supply became available for research, reducing one historical source of variability. At the same time, the therapeutic narrative introduced fresh controversy. Opponents feared medical legitimization would bleed into broader liberalization. Proponents argued that medical access and rigorous science would reduce harm by replacing clandestine markets with regulated supply for those who needed it. The controversies and roadblocks are therefore not merely technical, they are political and ethical, entangled with narratives about risk, autonomy, and state responsibility. The way forward is not a single policy, but a spectrum of measures. Rigorous, fundable research into long-term effects paired with pragmatic, evidence-driven harm reduction in the here and now. That means expanding drug-checking services, supporting prospective cohort studies that recruit before exposure, standardizing cognitive batteries and imaging protocols so meta-analyses can truly aggregate, and, crucially, destigmatizing researchers who work in this fraught space so that high-quality science does not require heroic persistence. Seen from the vantage of a long history, the arc is recognizable. New technologies create new social practices, markets adapt, myths and marketing shape behaviors, harms reveal themselves in clusters that are then met by localized improvisations, testing tents, public advisories, community counsellors, while policy lags and rhetoric surges. The work of the next decades will be to make the improvisation systematic and evidence-driven, to translate the practical wisdom of harm reductionists into formal infrastructure, and to keep the science rigorous in the face of politics. In the meantime, the simple human lesson is unchanged. Where there are chemical promises, there will be shortcuts and substitutes, and where there is risk, the best mitigations are information, honest regulation, and compassionately administered care. So the tale of Molly, of adulterants, of PMA and methadone and the rest, folds into the tale of bodies taxed and saved, of tents with testing tables, of lab spectrometers humming behind canvas. The acute emergencies, heat, water imbalance, serotonin storms, the thud of arrhythmia, are the immediate acts. The long-term sequelae, contested and murky, are the epilogue that researchers still write in incomplete sentences. The institutional impediments, scheduling, stigma, scarce funding, have been stubborn but not invincible. The field has, in recent years, found paths forward, better tools, clearer protocols, community partnerships that recognise people who use drugs as stakeholders rather than as moral problems. It is an imperfect détente, but it is progress. If there is a final irony worth whispering as the lights go down, it is that purity itself, the slick promise of crystalline certainty, turned out to be a fragile commodity. Markets will always seek to brand simplicity. Chemists, regulators, clinicians, and communities will always contend with complexity. The most practical and humane approach is not to invent a new morality around a substance, but to accept the messiness, to measure it, to warn against it, and to staff the tents with people who will test, advise, and, if needed, save a life. History teaches, gently and insistently, that knowledge built in public, with humility and rigour, bends toward fewer surprises and fewer tragedies. The renaissance that people who study drugs like to call clinical, bureaucratic, and almost devotional did not announce itself with fireworks. It unrolled in careful consent forms in fluorescent-lit rooms that smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, in playlists chosen with the same seriousness one might reserve for a funeral or a wedding, and in the slow, repeated ritual of two therapists sitting on either side of a bedside lamp while an exhausted veteran learned to say the words of a memory, without the tremor that had lived in them for years. That scene, a chorus of paper charts and human breath, is where MDMA's 21st century life begins to read like a different kind of story. Not a street legend about euphoria and collapse, nor a police blotter, but a clinical chronicle of hypothesis, method, regulation, and stubborn incremental care. Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, founded in 1986, had been the sort of persistent figure historians like to describe with the measured astonishment reserved for pastors and litigants. He had spent decades agitating for the right to do what looks obvious in retrospect, to test, carefully and ethically, whether a drug with a checkered legal past could help people for whom other treatments had failed. That insistence took shape in a pragmatic architecture. MAPS raised money through donations and grants, they trained therapists, they negotiated the labyrinthine protocols of the US Food and Drug Administration and institutional review boards, and they worked with clinical investigators such as Michael C. Mithoefer, MD, who carried the practical load of putting MDMA into a research setting. Writing manuals, designing psychotherapy models, shepherding patients through preparatory and integration work. Bessel van der Kolk's name, too, began to be read in the same breath. The Boston trauma clinician, whose later book, The Body Keeps the Score, would amplify for the public the idea that certain kinds of trauma might require treatments that reach not just cognition, but the felt somatic register of memory. The clinical program that emerged in the 2000s and 2010s was not an improvisation. It was a literal manual. Protocols were standardized across sites, and that standardization was part scientific necessity and part ethical promise, that patient safety and reproducibility should outstrip the wishful thinking that had characterized earlier, less controlled experiments. The model settled into a recognizable choreography. First came screening, somatic and psychiatric, to rule out cardiovascular risk, psychosis or bipolar disorder that might be destabilized by serotonergic surges. Then came preparatory psychotherapy, 1, sometimes 2 sessions in which therapists established rapport, described set and setting, rehearsed grounding techniques, and negotiated the fragile ground of consent. The key sessions themselves usually lasted 8 hours. Patient and 2 therapists reclined on chaise or couch, music played, eye shades could be used if the person preferred inward work. The therapist's voice was a boat on a long sea of sounds guiding tension, sometimes saying nothing at all. Dosing was calibrated. Many trials used an initial dose. In MAPS's protocols, frequently 125 milligrams with the option of a supplemental half dose an hour and a half later, and trial designs typically allowed for 2 or 3 such assisted sessions spaced weeks apart. Integration psychotherapy followed every dosing session, an insistence that the pharmacological opening be threaded into durable behavioural and cognitive change. It was a painstaking model. It was expensive. It was to many in the field ethically necessary. The early published clinical signals were tentative and then steadily more confident. Michael Mithoefer's randomized controlled study, published in 2011, one of the first modern controlled demonstrations of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, contained what would become familiar features: small sample sizes by the standards of large pharmaceutical trials, carefully documented improvements on the clinician-administered PTSD scale, and a litany of caution about the need for larger, better controlled work. Over the 2010s, Phase 2 trials replicated and refined those signals across different populations: combat veterans, assault survivors, first responders. The data, read as whole, suggested something clinically interesting. Not a metaphysical cure, but a treatment with unusually large effect sizes for people who had failed other treatments. The effect sizes were large enough to raise eyebrows in regulatory corridors. Anecdotes of single patients' recoveries circulated in the media and in clinicians' conferences like strange prayers. That human material mattered. So did the numbers. Regulatory authorities noticed. In 2017, the FDA conferred breakthrough therapy designation on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, an administrative move that recognizes a drug development pathway when preliminary evidence suggests substantial improvement over existing therapies. It was, in bureaucratic language, a blessing. It also functioned as a political hinge. Breakthrough designation carried with it expedited review pathways and increased interaction with reviewers, but also a heightened spotlight. Advocates rejoiced, and critics sharpened their pens. MAPS created MAPS Public Benefit Corporation to steward the development and potential commercialization of GMP-grade MDMA. Producers were located, manufacturing standards negotiated, import permits coaxed out of agencies that still regarded the molecule as an emblem of illicit commerce. In short, the movement of MDMA from street chemistry to good manufacturing practice was an exercise in diplomacy as much as in pharmaceutical logistics. That translation from outlaw to medicine exposed knots that had nothing to do with molecules and everything to do with human systems. Blinding, always the small political joke in psychedelic research, became glaringly problematic. MDMA has unmistakable subjective effects. Active placebos, small doses of MDMA or other stimulating drugs, were used to try to blunt expectancy effects, but blinding remained an imperfect art. Expectation bias, allegiance effects where therapists' belief in a treatment colours outcomes, and the difficulties of recruiting diverse populations all showed up in statistical appendices. Safety monitoring worked, generally. In controlled clinic-bound settings, serious adverse events were rare, cardiac and psychiatric screens reduced risk, and most side effects were transient and manageable. But the trials were, for the most part, conducted on patient populations that were not representative of the global diversity of PTSD sufferers. Veterans, often male and white, and survivors who had the resources, network, and legal latitude to participate in clinical trials remained overrepresented. That skew fed later conversations about equity, access, and what it means to say a treatment works. Therapist training was the other crucial bottleneck. The therapeutic model that appeared effective required a team, usually 2 therapists with special training, one often male, and one female to minimize transference risks, who could sit with an unmoored human whose guardedness had been briefly softened by a potent empathogen. The ethical seams here were obvious and necessary. Boundaries had to be trained and policed. Supervision had to be continuous. Reporting mechanisms for misconduct non-negotiable. Regulatory proposals proposed certification boards, continuing education and licensing that would not be a mere pad for malpractice insurance, but a community of practice with real teeth, peer review, complaint mechanisms and public registries. Cost estimations for a course of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, often several tens of thousands of dollars when therapist time and facility costs were counted, raised urgent questions about who would benefit if MDMA became an approved medicine. Would it be the insured suburban veteran? Or could a public option be created that guaranteed access for marginalised survivors of violence, many of whom had borne the brunt of punitive drug policies for decades? Designing market and delivery systems around those ethical questions became a central policy debate as Phase 3 trials took shape. The trial architecture ballooned. MAPS and its collaborators negotiated multi-site Phase 3 trials across the United States and in other jurisdictions that allowed drug-assisted psychotherapy research, sometimes extending into Canada and Europe where institutional approvals were feasible. Those trials attempted, as trials must, to be pragmatic about heterogeneity while maintaining scientific rigour. They measured not only cardinal outcomes like changes in CAP scores, but also functional outcomes, return to work, relational stability, reductions in comorbid substance use, and they established post-trial follow-up periods to assess durability. The results, as the 2020s progressed, were read by both enthusiasts and skeptics as promising. For many participants, the treatment produced clinically meaningful improvements. For some, it produced remission, and in most the gains persisted at follow-up intervals that suggested more than transient mood elevation. It would be dishonest to narrate this period without noting the constant friction between hope and caution. Some researchers remained publicly skeptical, pointing to the small sizes and to fundamental methodological problems in psychedelic research. Expectancy and unblinding, therapist effects, the difficulty of scaling a labour-intensive psychotherapeutic model. There were also genuine safety concerns about addiction and neurotoxicity, which the clinical literature largely did not support in the controlled setting, but which refused to go away in public discourse. The potential for diversion, MDMA making its way into street markets or into off-label clinical use without proper oversight, was a practical problem that regulatory frameworks sought to address with tight distribution controls, but it remained a policy and enforcement headache for nations with already burdened public health systems. If the clinical renaissance could be described as a courtyard of method and regulation, then the next room in the house was memory. The cultural ledger that had been written and rewritten about MDMA since it first moved from laboratories into therapist offices, and then into clubs, and into the hands of law enforcement. That ledger is messy. It is contested not only by data, but by music and memory. The stories we tell about MDMA have an architecture. There is the mythic early therapist tale, told in the halting diaries of psychotherapists who in the 70s and early 80s discovered that the molecule could ease access to feeling and memory, who described it as an empathogen because it seemed in their hands to make compassionate listening easier. Alexander Shulgin's technical descriptions in the 1970s and 1980s and the proliferation of anecdotal newsletters and seminars became the seed of a narrative that placed the therapist and the patient in the centre. Then, when the music started and the ecstasy economy bloomed in the late 80s, on the dance floors of Manchester's Hacienda, in the illegal raves that the British state would attempt to stem with the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994, a different story was written, this one with neon and a beat. MDMA as catalyst of communal rapture, but also a symptom in moral panic stories about overdoses, organised crime and social disorder. The tabloids fed those narratives. So did policymakers who found in them a rhetorical lever for prohibition. The modern counter-narrative, the therapeutic renaissance, was amplified not least by memoir and reportage. Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score 2014 presented MDMA as a tool in a clinician's toolbox. His accounts humanised clinicians' experiences with patients who had tried everything else. Documentary filmmakers and journalists, hungry for angle, returned to the clinical rooms and produced stories that were more sympathetic to the patient's plight. Yet the cultural plenum remained uneven. The memoirs that most often reached policymakers did not always belong to the people most affected by war on drugs policies. In public hearings and congressional reports, the voices amplified were disproportionately those of clinicians, white veterans, celebrity advocates and philanthropic donors. The stories of people in inner cities who had been arrested, jailed and stigmatised for MDMA use, and who now needed a different kind of social medicine, received far less attention. This uneven amplification was not neutral. It shaped funding priorities and the framing of who counts as a legitimate stakeholder in MDMA's future. Music and art also acted as historians in their own idiom. Rave culture's rhythms carried testimonies both celebratory and cautionary. DJs and scene participants wrote tracks and manifestos that lauded the communal bonding MDMA seemed to facilitate. At the same time, the persistence of party-related tragedies in media narratives, hypothermia, adulterated pills, ensured a countervailing moral note. Films and books sometimes softened into sentimentality, sometimes hardened into cautionary tales. Journalists searching for drama tended to highlight extremes, and extremes make policy committees nervous. Academia did its own kind of telling. Neuroimaging studies that described decreases in amygdala reactivity and increases in prosocial hormones like oxytocin were translated into press releases and then into a lay vocabulary that suggested MDMA's truth-telling and empathogenic capacities. Those words, while alluring, are shorthand for complex neurobiology that resists the simplicity of pop metaphors. But metaphors matter. They shape public appetite for regulation and research dollars. Memory politics, who remembers what is remembered and who gets to decide the moral of the story, became a field of struggle. Advocacy groups representing survivors of trauma elevated narratives of MDMA as salvation. Conservative public health officials raised the spectre of renormalizing a recreationally popular drug that had been linked, in the public imagination, to criminal enterprise. The fields of harm reduction and medicalization were not opposed so much as entangled. Harm reduction activists argued correctly that if MDMA has therapeutic utility, then criminalization had been a collateral harm that had stopped potential users from accessing safer contexts. Medical advocates warned that normalizing recreational use would undercut the kind of controlled context in which safety could be guaranteed. Both sides had a point. Both sides were right about parts of the story. And because memory is political, certain voices were routinely marginalized. People who had lived through punitive policing were less frequently given platforms at policy discussions. The party culture that created much of the public image of MDMA, often young, often working class, often black or brown among those arrested, did not always have the organizational capital to shape narratives on the national stage. Even within the patient groups who benefited most from trials, those with little access to private healthcare or flexible schedules had less access to trial participation. Histories of exclusion were repeated even as a new medical history was being written. The cultural debate often turned on spectacle, a therapeutic séance in a clinical vinyl chair, a headline about nightlife fatalities. The public loved an either-or. The truth was, as it so often is, both and neither. When that truth is laid out flat, the final demand, the policy question, is simple only in form. What should societies do now that MDMA seems to have both therapeutic promise and a troublesome past? The answer must be plural and pragmatic, and above all rooted in ethics that accepts complication. One future is strict medicalization. MDMA becomes an approved prescription medicine for PTSD, dispensed only in licensed clinics and administered by certified therapists following standardized protocols. That model has virtues. It prioritizes patient safety. It allows for reimbursement mechanisms under public and private insurers, and it makes diversion easier to track because the substance moves through regulated pharmaceutical distribution chains. But it carries risks too. It risks creating an expensive boutique medicine available primarily to the insured and to those with good insurance navigation. It risks a gyration of pharmaceutical capitalism where a single molecule, once communal, becomes proprietary, marketed and insulated. It risks excluding communities who have long borne the burden of punitive enforcement. Unless access plans, sliding scale models and public funding commitments are part of the architecture, medicalization alone will harden inequities. A second future is decriminalization combined with robust public health measures. The Portuguese model of decriminalization, formal possession is not a criminal offence, but public health interventions are available, is instructive. Decriminalization reduces the harms of criminal records, broken careers and social exclusion. It opens the door for low-barrier harm reduction interventions like drug checking at festivals, outreach and public education. But decriminalization without regulation of quality and without a public interest approach to safe supply can leave people exposed to adulterated pills and criminal markets. And decriminalisation alone does not create the structures needed for supervised, ethical, therapeutic use. A third future is a muddled persistence of prohibition alongside incremental harm reduction. Some countries will continue to treat MDMA as an illicit substance, deploying police resources and limited harm reduction programs. This model perpetuates many of the same harms of the late 20th century: criminal records, dangerous adulterants, and a lack of access to new treatments for those who need them most. The wisest path, if wisdom were a public policy, might be a synthesis. Regulated medical access could be created for specific indications, PTSD first, where the evidence is strongest, accompanied by a strong program of training, licensing and oversight for therapists. Those clinics should not be the only avenue of access. Decriminalisation of personal possession could reduce the punitive costs that have been concentrated in poor and minority communities. Harm reduction, pill checking at events, funded hotlines, emergency medical protocols, public education about risks and interactions should not be an afterthought. It should be the constitutional text of any sane drug policy. Finally, restorative justice measures should be implemented. Expungement clinics, funding for communities damaged by enforcement, and inclusion of those communities in the regulatory structures that govern the new therapies. Justice in this formulation is not only clinical efficacy, but also social repair. From the research perspective, several priorities deserve investment. Long-term safety studies across diverse populations are essential. We must know not merely that outcomes at 6 months look promising, but that gains persist at 5 years and beyond, and that there are no subtle, cumulative, cognitive or affective harms emerging only with time. We must fund trials that purposefully recruit from communities of colour, from low-income populations, from those with comorbid substance use, so that conclusions about generalisability are not mere extrapolations. We need better biomarkers to predict who will benefit and who will not. We need mechanistic work, neuroimaging, endocrinology, genetics, but always married to the human story of relational therapy, not placed above it. We must refine therapeutic protocols to find the minimum effective dose of therapist time without undermining efficacy. That is not a cost containment exercise only, but a question of scalability and justice. The ethical guardrails ought to be both simple and strict. Informed consent must be robust. Every patient should understand the knowns and the unknowns. The long arc of criminalisation and stigma should be acknowledged in the consent process, because the social context shapes healing. Training programs for therapists must incorporate explicit boundaries, cultural humility training and mechanisms to report and address boundary violations. Manufacturing and distribution must be transparent and subject to public audit. Profiteering should be possible but bounded by public interest commitments, especially where public funds have supported research. Research and clinical programs should be required to include community advisory boards that include members with lived experience of drug enforcement, addiction, and trauma. Practically several steps could smooth the path. Governments should set up pilot programs to test delivery models, non-profit clinics embedded in public health centres, mobile units that bring therapy to underserved areas, telehealth adjuncts for preparatory and integration work to reduce cost burdens, subsidised training pipelines that recruit from marginalised communities to ensure the therapeutic workforce is not just homogenous. Regulatory agencies should create registries to monitor outcomes and adverse events, a public good that might help avert scandals and maintain public trust. Internationally, UN conventions and national treaties should be recalibrated to allow for controlled medical use, while providing tools to minimise diversion. The law can be flexible without being feckless. At the cultural level, the work is as much about memory as it is about medicine. Governments and philanthropic organisations should fund projects that restore the narratives of those most harmed by prohibition. Histories that include the stories of arrest, of lost employment, of families split, and create reparation programs that are not merely rhetorical. Storytelling matters. The public must hear not only the clinicians' successes, but also the victims of punitive policies. Museums, oral histories, and archival projects should be supported to hold that complexity. A future that wishes to be just will insist that the music and the clinic both have a place at the table, and that the policy architecture resists turning MDMA into either saint or scapegoat. Finally, we must acknowledge a dirty truth with a smile and a sigh. Drugs do not live in policy frameworks. They live in human bodies and economies. MDMA has already been many things across the globe. A lab curiosity, a therapeutic adjunct, a recreational companion to dancers' late-night communion, an object of law enforcement, a scapegoat in political panic. Any policy that pretends to remove that molecule's cultural weight is naive. Instead, policy must be supple enough to hold contradictions, to allow a veteran in a clinic to find peace without making that the only path available to someone suffering elsewhere. To permit the existence of festivals while saving lives through on-site testing and medical presence. To allow profit but insist upon public goods in return. So what is the ethical closure? It is modest, it is procedural, it is unromantic. Create clinical access pathways with equity baked in, decriminalise to reduce harm and free public resources for health rather than punishment, invest in research that is larger and more representative, institute robust harm reduction services that meet people where they are, and finally enact restorative justice to repair the damage that punitive policies inflicted on communities around the world. In practice, this means licensing clinics, training therapists in accountable ways, funding mobile and sliding scale services, establishing public registries, deploying pill testing and medical contingents at public events, expunging records for simple possession, and funding community advisory boards as part of any regulatory approval. There is a moral undertow to the whole enterprise. MDMA's story is not only about neurotransmitters and regulatory filings, it is about memory and forgetting, about the way a society assigns moral shame, about which suffering is heard and which is dismissed. The therapeutic renaissance offers a chance to rewrite part of that story, but it must not be allowed to rewrite history into erasure. Those who once sang on dance floors should not be written out of the book because clinicians now hold a different kind of authority. Those who were arrested and marginalised should be made whole insofar as law and policy can make anyone whole. And so, with hands careful and slow, we close this chapter of the tale, knowing that the future will be unwritten in messy ink. There will be approvals and rejections. There will be clinics opening and closing, philanthropies waxing and waning, music pulsing and sometimes quiet. There will be tragedies, and there will be recoveries. The best policy will be neither zeal nor fear, but a stubborn, patient tending to evidence and to justice, with a readiness to correct course when evidence and equity demand it. If the history of MDMA teaches us anything, it is that hope without guardrails is folly, and regulation without compassion is cruelty. Let us fold both into the same bed and listen for a while to the slow, measured breath of a world trying to remember itself correctly.